Empires rose, thrones fell, yet their rulers left stories time could never erase. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. The woman the court feared as the Castilian falcon was not born to rule, but the blood in her veins carried the weight of two royal lines. Isabella of Castile entered the world in 1451, the daughter of John II of Castile and his second wife, Isabella of Portugal. But her father's death left the kingdom in the hands of her much older half-brother, Henry IV, a king whose authority fractured as quickly as it formed. As unrest spread through the noble houses and rivals plotted to control the throne, Isabella's childhood was shaped by the instability that followed. She was moved from palace to palace, watched closely, and taught obedience under the guise of protection. The court called her quiet, but behind that quiet was a growing sense of calculation, forged not from rebellion, but from observation. When Isabella was just 3 years old, her half-brother ascended to the throne. King Henry IV's reign was marked by indecision, scandal, and a court divided by competing factions. His marriage to Joan of Portugal produced a daughter, Joanna, whose legitimacy was questioned by many nobles and church officials. As doubt consumed the court, Isabella's position in the royal line began to shift. Though she was far from the center of power, her lineage made her a potential alternative. Yet with each passing year, Henry's allies sought to push her further from succession, wary of the loyalty she might one day command. She was sent to live in the town of Arevalo with her mother and younger brother, Alfonso. Isolated from the main currents of courtly life, she witnessed the slow mental decline of her mother and the toll it took on her family. The young princess spent these years in modest surroundings, far from the splendor of the royal household. But while other royal children were raised in luxury, Isabella was raised in uncertainty. Her education shaped more by the politics of survival than ceremonial privilege. As unrest in Castile intensified, powerful nobles began to question the king's leadership. Some turned their attention to Alfonso as a possible successor. Others began to look toward Isabella, not because she sought power, but because she did not yet reject it. By 1468, Castile had become a kingdom of open challenge. After Alfonso's suspicious death, at just 14 years old, Isabella became the focus of a new strategy. The nobles, desperate for a stable alternative to Henry's disintegrating rule, pressured her to claim the throne. But she refused to do so without consent. Instead, she agreed to a carefully negotiated title, Princess of Asturias, heir presumptive to the Castilian crown. It was not a rebellion, it was a bargain, one that would later give her legal ground to rule. But this agreement was made in the presence of enemies, not allies. Henry never stopped trying to undermine her standing. He arranged possible marriages that would weaken her claim, including unions with foreign princes and internal rivals. Each match was designed to secure his control and dilute hers. Isabella remained firm. She would not marry without her own consent. This position, rare for any woman of her rank, marked her as unpredictable. She had not challenged the king publicly, but her refusals were acts of resistance. The court took notice. In private, her defiance unsettled even the most powerful men. The nobles who once dismissed her as harmless began to reconsider. She was not loud, she was not impulsive, But the quiet precision of her decisions began to resemble something far more dangerous. And while she moved carefully within the limits set for her, those around her began to prepare for something else entirely. A succession, not by inheritance, but by force. Isabella's claim to power existed in the shadow of a king who never intended to share it. Her half-brother, Henry IV of Castile, held the throne by right of birth, but ruled through compromise and fear. From the early days of his reign, questions followed him about his authority, his alliances, and even the legitimacy of his only child. But while nobles argued over claims and bloodlines, Isabella was pushed from the center of court life into a life of uncertain obedience. She was moved between fortresses and monasteries, not for her protection, but to keep her isolated from power brokers who might rally around her name. Still, she listened. She observed. She learned what happened to those who waited and what became of those who refused. The death of her younger brother Alfonso in 1468 removed the last acceptable male rival to Henry's rule. His death, unexplained and suspicious, shook the court and stripped Castile of a politically neutral heir. The nobles turned back to Isabella. They saw in her a solution to the king's deepening crisis, a princess of unchallenged lineage and calm resolve. In response, Henry attempted to regain control. He offered Isabella the title of heir in name only, under strict conditions. She accepted the title, but refused to surrender her autonomy. It was a political maneuver that gave her standing without pledging loyalty to a weakening crown. From this moment forward, Isabella's decisions would no longer be made for her. At the heart of the king's strategy was marriage. Henry knew that Isabella's value to the realm was not only in her claim, but in the alliances her marriage could create or destroy. He proposed suitors who served his interests. First, a brother of the French king, then a Portuguese royal, then even a union with the controversial Marquis of Villena. Each arrangement came with promises and pressure. But Isabella stalled. She refused one match after another, citing her right to choose. Each refusal stirred conflict at court, raising concerns about her loyalty and drawing the attention of those who saw in her something more than a pawn. The choice she finally made changed the fate of Iberia. In October of 1469, Isabella married Ferdinand of Aragon without Henry's consent. It was a calculated defiance, sealed in secret and backed by allies who saw unity between Castile and Aragon as a path towards stability. The marriage was not born of love or ceremony. It was an alliance between two monarchs in waiting, two crowns not yet joined. But the consequences were immediate. Henry declared the agreement invalid and revoked her status as heir. He turned once again to his daughter Joanna, whose contested birth had already split the kingdom in two. The nobility was now forced to choose between a discredited king's line and a princess who had chosen her own path. Isabella had crossed a line that few women and even fewer royals dared to cross in Castile. She had acted without royal permission, without male direction, and without apology. The road ahead would be shaped not only by war and diplomacy, but by the long reach of that single act of resistance. And though the throne remained out of reach, her will had become something no decree could reverse. Isabella's decision to marry Ferdinand of Aragon was not sealed in court, but in secret. The union was arranged carefully, its terms set with legal precision in the Pact of Cervera, later reaffirmed in Valladolid in 1469. The marriage contract protected Castilian autonomy and promised shared rule. But beneath its formal language lay the boldest act of defiance in Isabella's life. She had rejected the king's chosen suitors and chosen her own, a man who was heir to another crown. Ferdinand, only a year younger than Isabella, came not as a subordinate prince, but as a future monarch with his own ambitions. Together, they represented a union of two kingdoms that had long stood apart. But this alliance was not forged with the approval of Castile's ruler. King Henry IV had forbidden the marriage, viewing it as a threat to his authority and his legacy. Isabella went forward anyway. The ceremony was conducted in Valladolid with forged papal dispensation. The document, later legitimized, allowed the union despite the couple's close familial ties. It was a quiet wedding, lacking the pageantry of royal approval, but heavy with political consequence. The moment the vows were exchanged, the power map of Iberia shifted. In the eyes of the law, Isabella had violated royal command. In the eyes of her supporters, she had stepped into leadership. From that moment forward, she was no longer just a potential heir. She was a sovereign acting with will, vision, and resolve. The reaction in Castile was immediate and fractured. Loyalists to Henry accused her of rebellion. Noble houses split once more, not along family lines, but along visions of power. Some feared Aragonese influence would overrun Castilian politics. Others believed only this marriage could prevent the kingdom from splintering entirely. The court of Henry IV responded by declaring his daughter Joanna the rightful heir, reversing Isabella's earlier recognition. Factions coalesced around this dispute. Civil conflict now became a matter not of ideas, but of banners, allegiances, and armed enforcement. In the months that followed, Isabella and Ferdinand traveled through Castile to rally support. They moved deliberately, choosing cities and strongholds loyal to their claim. They gathered allies, not just through bloodlines, but through promises of reform, of stability, and of unity. But each declaration of loyalty also drew the attention of rivals. The Archbishop of Toledo, once a supporter, shifted sides. The powerful Mendoza family hesitated. Even those who stood with Isabella worried about the balance of power between husband and wife, between Castile and Aragon. As the kingdom edged toward war, the tension moved from the halls of nobles to the fields of soldiers. The marriage had unified two rulers, but it had divided Castile. The question was no longer whether Isabella could be queen. It was whether she could hold the crown in the face of opposition that now counted bishops, generals, and foreign powers among its ranks. What began as a secret pact now stood at the center of a national crisis. And while Isabella rode beside her new husband, dressed in the colors of her claim, those who opposed her began preparing for something more than politics. They were preparing for war. The civil war that followed Isabella's marriage to Ferdinand was not a single battle, but a slow unraveling of loyalty across a fractured kingdom. Though the couple had secured key strongholds and the backing of influential nobles, their right to rule was far from universally accepted. The crown remained contested, and Isabella's claim, rooted in lineage but stained by defiance, was under constant attack. Her enemies branded her a usurper. They called her a woman, made bold by ambition, not by right. From the halls of Segovia to the streets of Seville, the court was no longer united by allegiance to a single monarch, but split by the force of competing narratives. And while swords were drawn in open fields, another conflict took shape in whispered conversations and closed council rooms. Within Isabella's own circle, divisions deepened. Ferdinand's Aragonese advisors arrived with their own customs, expectations, and political designs. They pushed for policies that favored their homeland and advised Ferdinand with growing confidence. Their presence unsettled Castilian nobles, many of whom had supported Isabella precisely because she was one of their own. In public, the crown appeared unified, two rulers side by side. But behind closed doors, that unity began to crack. Ferdinand, flush with the confidence of his growing influence, started to negotiate treaties and make administrative decisions without Isabella's full consent. He convened councils in her absence. He appointed Aragonese commanders to positions of influence in Castilian territories. The balance of power, once delicately shared, was beginning to tilt. For Isabella, the weight of the purple cloak became more than ceremonial. It was a burden of expectation, scrutiny, and silent resistance. She had fought to be recognized as rightful heir. Now, with that recognition fragile and conditional, she was forced to defend not only her rule, but her identity as queen in her own right. Her supporters grew restless. Some questioned her silence in the face of Ferdinand's overreach. Others accused her of yielding too easily to the structures of marriage and monarchy. Every decision she made was measured not just by its outcome, but by how firmly it asserted her sovereignty. In this atmosphere of tension, Isabella began to centralize her authority. She insisted that royal decrees bear both her name and Ferdinand's, with her name listed first in Castile. She restricted access to her private councils and began cultivating a network of secretaries and legal scholars loyal to her alone. At the same time, she maintained the appearance of unity, aware that open conflict with Ferdinand would weaken both their positions. But behind the controlled diplomacy lay a constant negotiation of power. In moments of doubt, Isabella consulted religious advisors, reviewed legal charters, and studied the precedents of monarchs who had ruled in divided courts. She was not seeking permission. She was seeking leverage. The war against the supporters of Joana la Beltraneja continued in military terms, but the real battle was already shifting inward, between advisors, between regions, between the crown's two heads. Every decision made in council chambers shaped the future of a united monarchy that had not yet been fully born. And as the crown inched closer, Isabella understood that securing it would not mean possession. Not if the throne itself could be overshadowed by a husband's unchecked hand. The Battle of Toro in 1476 became the fulcrum on which Isabella's claim to the throne turned, not because of its outcome, but because of what she made it mean. Militarily, the battle ended in confusion. Both sides, those loyal to Isabella and those backing Joana la Beltraneja, claimed success. Yet Isabella acted with urgency, framing the clash as a decisive victory. She issued proclamations, staged ceremonies, and controlled the message across Castile. Within weeks, key nobles began to shift their loyalty. Neutral cities raised her banner. Her version of the battle, not its facts, became the political reality. In a kingdom exhausted by conflict, perception had more power than the sword. With the crown now firmly in her grasp, Isabella moved quickly to reassert control over the fractured institutions of Castile. The royal council, once dominated by hereditary elites, was restructured with legal scholars and clerics loyal to her authority. she strengthened the position of the crown over the towns, enforcing royal law above local privileges. Corrupt judges were dismissed. Municipal charters were reviewed and rewritten. The monarchy began to function not as a balancing force among competing nobles, but as the central source of law and governance. It was a shift that reduced the power of the aristocracy while binding the kingdom more tightly to the person of the queen. Yet the peace she created was not built on reconciliation. It was built on order. Former allies who had supported her out of convenience were soon reminded of the cost of disloyalty. Land confiscations and public humiliations served as warnings. Noble families who had wavered during the war were excluded from the new power structure. The crown's justice extended into areas once governed by tradition and custom. Her measures brought a new stability, but also a sense of unease. The memory of betrayal, at court, in council, in battle, shaped her approach to power. She would never again allow her rule to rest on the uncertain loyalties of others. At the same time, Isabella turned her attention to the church. A devout Catholic, she saw faith as a pillar of unity. But in her hands, religion became not just a moral compass, but a tool of governance. She began appointing bishops who mirrored her priorities: reform, discipline, and centralization. Monasteries were audited. Clergy were held to stricter standards. And most notably, she and Ferdinand began petitioning Rome for greater control over religious appointments in Spain. The church in Castile, once autonomous in many of its dealings, was gradually brought under royal influence. But with that consolidation came something else. In the shadow of these reforms, attention turned toward the large population of conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under social or economic pressure. Rumors spread of secret rites and divided loyalties. Isabella, determined to unify the kingdom under one faith, supported measures that blurred the line between religion and suspicion. In 1478, with papal approval, the Spanish Inquisition was established, not as a papal tribunal, but as a royal institution. It would answer not to Rome, but to the crown. The victory at Toro had ended one war. But the structures now rising in its wake suggested another kind of conflict was beginning, one not fought in fields, but in courtrooms and chapels, where faith and obedience would soon be judged under fire. By the early 1480s, Isabella ruled a kingdom no longer defined by rivalry, but by structure. The civil war had ended, Castile had stabilized, and the apparatus of monarchy had taken firm root in the institutions of law, justice, and church. But with power consolidated came a new challenge: how to shape the soul of the kingdom itself. Isabella, now reigning with the full authority of queen, turned her attention from rebellion to reform, from enemies on the battlefield to dissent within the heart of her realm. Her vision was one of unity, political, cultural, and above all, religious. And in pursuit of that unity, she approved one of the most enduring instruments of control in Spanish history: the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. Though the Spanish Inquisition received its legal sanction from Rome, it was unmistakably a royal institution. Its foundation in 1478 was not driven by church hierarchy, but by the crown's concern over conversos, converted Jews, whose sincerity was increasingly questioned by segments of the population. For Isabella, whose devotion to Catholic orthodoxy had long shaped her worldview, religious conformity became synonymous with national stability. Any division in belief was perceived as a crack in the structure of the state. Under this logic, faith became policy. Her confessor, Tomás de Torquemada, was appointed Inquisitor General in 1483, and the work of purifying the realm began in earnest. At first, the Inquisition focused on cases of suspected heresy, but its reach quickly extended beyond doctrine. It investigated ancestry, examined daily behavior, scrutinized customs and speech. Public trials, secret testimony, and the confiscation of property became tools not just of religious correction, but of political enforcement. The accused, stripped of rights and reputation, often vanished into prison cells or public rituals of penance. Executions followed. The spectacle of orthodoxy now unfolded not only in churches but in plazas, staged as affirmations of royal authority. Although Isabella rarely intervened directly in trials, every act carried out by the tribunal was done in her name. She received reports, read summaries, and occasionally granted clemency. But the machinery of the Inquisition moved steadily forward, answering not to Rome, but to the crown. The Queen saw the institution as a necessary response to the deep anxieties of her divided kingdom. Religious unity, in her view, was the final step toward lasting peace. And yet, there were moments, quiet and obscured, when questions lingered. Chroniclers noted delays in approval. Some recorded rumors of hesitation, of private concerns shared with advisors. But hesitation did not halt policy. The Inquisition marked a transformation in Isabella's rule, from consolidation to control, from power shared to power enforced. It reflected her evolving understanding of monarchy as not only a political office, but a divine responsibility. The iron crown she wore was not only a symbol of her authority, but of her role as guardian of a faith that could not be questioned without consequence. And as the tribunals expanded into Aragon, as records piled with confessions and sentences, a new image of Castile began to emerge, one of orthodoxy without tolerance and unity without dissent. Outside her borders, foreign rulers watched with interest, some with fear. But inside her realm, the flames of doctrine now lit the path forward. And those who did not walk that path would be judged not only by priests, but by the laws of the Queen. In January of 1492, the banner of Castile was raised above the Alhambra. The Nasrid Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, had surrendered after months of siege and years of attrition. With the fall of the city, the centuries-long campaign known as the Reconquista reached its conclusion. Isabella and Ferdinand entered the city not merely as monarchs, but as victors of a religious war that had spanned generations. Yet beyond the ceremonies and proclamations, beyond the symbolism and procession, a different atmosphere lingered in the narrow streets. Granada had been a city of scholars, poets, merchants, and judges. Now it was a city of broken agreements and interrupted prayers. The surrender terms, though initially generous, promised protection of life, property, and religion. But they would not hold for long. Ferdinand, ever the military strategist, had negotiated the surrender terms personally, balancing pragmatism with conquest. He believed in staged assimilation, in holding ground as well as seizing it. Isabella, meanwhile, remained in the administrative centers of power, directing the policies that would reshape not just Granada, but the identity of Spain itself. Her concerns moved beyond garrisons and battlements. She turned to the work of integration, of religious oversight, of educational control, and of bureaucratic expansion. institutions were deployed to monitor not just behavior, but belief. Schools were restructured to reflect Catholic doctrine. Mosques were closed or converted. The native elite were slowly displaced from legal and civic life. In the official ledgers of Castile, the campaign was complete. In the lived reality of Granada, it was only beginning. The early promises made to the Muslim population, known as the capitulations, soon began to erode under pressure from both the crown and the church. Cardinal Cisneros, Isabella's influential spiritual advisor, initiated mass conversion campaigns, often accompanied by coercion and threat. Public burnings of Arabic texts signaled not only a cultural rupture, but the beginning of systematic erasure. Those who resisted were labeled insincere. Those who complied lived under suspicion, and all who remained were eventually faced with the same choice presented earlier to the Jews of Castile: conversion or expulsion. Within Isabella's court, there were moments of unease. Some advisors warned against rapid forced assimilation. Others feared that broken treaties would cast a shadow over future diplomacy. But the logic of unification had already become doctrine: one faith, one crown, one law. These principles, once aspirational, were now enforced with administrative clarity. The silence in Granada was not the silence of peace. It was the silence left behind when institutions replaced communities and when policy outlasted memory. Isabella did not govern with indifference. She read reports from the region, issued orders on the treatment of converts, and expressed concern over abuses. But she did not reverse course. Her vision of Spain as a kingdom defined by Catholic unity had become inseparable from her understanding of power itself. She saw it not as conquest, but as fulfillment. And yet, even as the banners flew and the chronicles recorded the moment as a sacred victory, something in the Queen's demeanor shifted. The applause of triumph faded into the routine of control. The streets of Granada were quiet now. Its gardens still bloomed, but its voice, its soul, had changed. And Isabella, though unmoved in resolve, now ruled over a kingdom that had traded plurality for permanence. In 1492, while the banners of Castile rose over the Alhambra, a different venture was quietly set in motion, one that would not mark the end of a war, but the beginning of an empire. That same year, under the authority of the Catholic monarchs, Christopher Columbus departed from the port of Palos. The voyage was framed as a search for a westward route to Asia, but in practice, it was something far more complex. It was an extension of Isabella's expanding vision of influence, conversion, and royal supremacy beyond the boundaries of Europe. Though the Queen's court had hesitated to fund Columbus in earlier years, shifting alliances and the promise of spiritual as well as material gain altered the calculus. After the fall of Granada, Isabella authorized the voyage in her name, securing legal titles over any new lands claimed. The terms were precise. The benefits would flow not only to Columbus, but to the crown. When word returned that land had been sighted, celebration moved quickly through the royal chambers. Columbus claimed territories for Castile, planted flags, and named settlements. But what came back with the news of discovery were not just stories of exotic shores. Reports soon included accounts of forced labor, destruction of native shrines, and the capture of local inhabitants. The monarchs requested clarification, issued instructions for fair treatment, and debated how to impose Christian order on a world they barely understood. But with every ship that crossed the Atlantic, the dynamic shifted. Control was increasingly measured not by maps but by ledgers, by what could be extracted, counted, and taxed. Within the royal administration, the Casa de Contratación was established in Seville to manage overseas trade, immigration, and exploration. Officials compiled inventories of gold, crops, and enslaved peoples. The early vision of peaceful expansion gave way to practical concerns, settler uprisings, indigenous resistance, and the rapid moral breakdown of colonial governance. But Isabella, though removed from the frontier, remained involved in policy. She reviewed legal frameworks, issued decrees on the evangelization of native peoples, and commissioned missionaries. She did not abandon the ideal of Christian expansion, but she faced the growing tension between that ideal and the actions carried out in her name. As territories multiplied, so did the contradictions. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, negotiated with Portugal, divided the non-European world into spheres of influence. This was not just a line drawn across the Atlantic. It was a declaration of imperial intent. Castile now claimed dominion over half the world, despite knowing almost nothing of the people who lived within it. The pursuit of wealth, the mission to convert, and the machinery of state bureaucracy fused into a single, unstoppable current. Ships returned to Seville, carrying more than goods. They carried expectations, and increasingly, violence. Behind palace walls, scrolls arrived filled with numbers and names, tributaries of an empire just beginning to form. The Queen, once focused on unifying a fractured Iberian kingdom, now presided over territories thousands of miles away. The world was no longer bounded by rivers or mountain ranges. It reached over oceans. And as her court expanded its reach, the power Isabella had fought to consolidate now had no visible edge and no clear limit to what it would demand. In the final decade of her reign, Queen Isabella of Castile no longer ruled from the center of a growing world, but from behind layers of grief, illness, and fading alliances. The kingdom she had unified, fortified, and expanded now faced a different kind of fragmentation, not from rebellion, but from fate. Her son and heir, Prince John, had once stood as the living promise of dynastic continuity. Raised with care, prepared for rule, he had married into the royal house of Habsburg, securing the crown's future in both blood and diplomacy. But in 1497, only months after his wedding, he died suddenly at the age of 19. With his death, the careful structure Isabella had built to preserve her legacy began to collapse inward. The next heir, her daughter Isabella of Aragon and Portugal, had already been married into the Portuguese royal family. She too died in childbirth shortly after John's passing, leaving behind a single infant son. That boy, Miguel, briefly stood as the link between the Iberian crowns, but he too would die before reaching his third year. Each death severed a line of succession that had once seemed secure. The queen who had overseen conquests and crusades was now forced to watch as her own house fell into uncertainty. Every treaty signed in hope now carried the weight of personal loss. Every dynastic match began to feel like a gamble made in vain. That weight fell most heavily on the shoulders of her remaining daughter, Joanna. Intelligent and devout, Joanna had been married to Philip of Habsburg, son of the Holy Roman Emperor, as part of the original strategy to align Castile with the powerful houses of Northern Europe. But the match was strained from the beginning. Philip showed little interest in Castilian customs or institutions. He moved between courts, courtiers, and regions, often without consulting his wife. Over time, Joanna's behavior began to draw concern. She became prone to long silences, emotional outbursts, and suspicion. Whether the result of isolation, grief, or deeper affliction, her instability became a political threat. Isabella, now in declining health, recognized the risks. She issued a series of instructions in her will to preserve the integrity of Castilian governance should Joanna prove unable to rule. She named Ferdinand as regent, but by then, the bond between them had weakened. Ferdinand had turned his focus increasingly toward Aragon, expanding its influence in Italy and negotiating alliances independent of Castile. Though they remained co-sovereigns in law, they had become distant in practice. Isabella continued to govern, but increasingly alone, her chamber quieter, her court hollowed by absence. In these final years, she revised laws, clarified succession, and sought to preserve the ideological core of her reign: the primacy of faith, the strength of the crown, and the unity of the realm. But as her physical strength declined, so did her ability to control what would follow. The empire she had helped to launch was already beginning to shift beyond her grasp. Her surviving heir was unstable, her co-ruler increasingly autonomous, and her political legacy at risk of fracture. The queen, who had once reshaped a continent, now found herself surrounded by questions she could not answer, not of conquest, but of consequence. And as her breath grew short and the ledgers closed, the legacy she left was not of triumph alone, but of a power that had outgrown its maker. Queen Isabella of Castile died on November 26, 1504, within the stone walls of the Alcazar of Segovia. At the moment of her death, she was one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Yet her body was weakened by years of illness, her court scattered by grief, and her realm on the edge of uncertainty. The will she left behind was detailed, meticulous, and politically charged. It attempted to hold together a kingdom she had spent her life shaping, a dynasty now threatened by loss, and a vision of rule that had grown larger than even she could control. She ordered to be buried simply, without grandeur, beneath the floor of a modest chapel in Granada, the city whose silence had once marked her greatest victory. But while her body was laid to rest beneath stone, her decisions would rise far beyond her time. Isabella's reign had transformed Castile from a fragmented realm into a centralized power with a shared language, religion, and royal authority. Her partnership with Ferdinand of Aragon had united two kingdoms in a political alliance that would later become the foundation of Spain. Through legal reform, military consolidation, and ecclesiastical control, she had redefined monarchy in Iberia, not as a balance among noble factions, but as a centralized instrument of governance. Yet that centralization came with a cost. The Spanish Inquisition, founded during her rule, became not just a tool of religious conformity, but a mechanism of fear. Thousands were investigated, many imprisoned or executed. Her 1492 decree expelling the Jews from Spain reshaped the population, erased generations of culture, and displaced families whose roots reached back centuries. The conversion of Muslims and suppression of Arabic traditions followed soon after. What she called purification became, in practice, exclusion. Beyond the peninsula, her patronage of Columbus and the voyages that followed opened a chapter in world history whose reach would extend across continents. Under her authority, Castile claimed territories in the Caribbean, Central America, and beyond. These conquests, framed at the time as missions of faith and expansion, soon revealed themselves to be systems of extraction and control. Colonization brought with it trade, religion, and administration, but also disease, forced labor, and systemic violence. The royal charters granted in Isabella's name became the legal instruments of empire. She had intended to spread Christianity. What followed was a transformation of entire societies, a redrawing of borders, and a reordering of the global economy that would last for centuries. In death, Isabella's reputation split along lines of belief and memory. To some, especially within the Church, she was remembered as a model of Christian monarchy, faithful, decisive, and morally resolute. Her beatification was proposed by Spanish clergy and remains under consideration to this day. To others, particularly in the modern era, her legacy is one of displacement, repression, and imperial violence. The policies she enacted outlived her by generations and shaped the moral foundation of the Spanish state. Through law, conquest, marriage, and religion, she had inscribed herself into the political DNA of the emerging Atlantic world. Her descendants inherited a complex empire built on both unity and contradiction. Her grandson, Charles V, would preside over a global dominion. Her name would appear in papal bulls, royal decrees, and colonial archives. But the systems she forged of crown and church, of faith and force, would eventually fuel the same tensions she sought to suppress. The Spain she created would become one of Europe's most formidable powers, yet it would also become a stage for revolts, inquisitions, and eventual decline. Even centuries later, Isabella's rule provokes both reverence and reckoning. Her monuments still stand, her policies still studied, her name still invoked in debates over power, religion, and empire. She remains a figure of immense consequence, a woman who stepped into a role defined by men and left it irreversibly changed. Whether saint or sovereign, architect or executioner, Isabella did not simply govern a kingdom, she reshaped the world's direction. Was she the savior of a fractured land, or the author of a storm that history could not contain? Her silence remains, but the echoes of her reign are still heard in languages spoken, borders drawn, and wounds still healing.